Hello board game brothers and sisters, I'm Adam Singer and welcome to another episode where I'll be letting you know of all the board games launching on Kickstarter and Gamefound over the next week. If you're new here, we do this every single week, so if you want to stay up to date, you can subscribe down below. But before we get started, I do like to go over some news and announcements that I just found out about over the past week. I do have some interesting ones for you. I don't believe this first one's coming to crowdfunding, but they did just announce a new edition of Seven Wonders Duel, and this one's going to be Lord of the Rings themed, but it's also going to be introducing some new mechanisms as well. So if you're not so interested in the theme, but you are a big fan of Seven Wonders Duel, this might still be one to check out. But if you're also a fan of the theme, then it's definitely one to check out because it's one that is in my collection and I'm never letting that one go, and I am interested to see what they change with this new version of the game. But I am not a huge fan of IPs on board games, and I do prefer the original theming, but I still am interested in this one. And speaking of two-player games, we do have two more two-player games coming from Reiner Knizia, and he also is famous for creating all sorts of games, but one of his most famous two-player games is Lost Cities, which is another game that I do have in my collection and I'm also never letting go. So naturally, I am really interested in this one. I haven't looked into how these two games actually play yet, but of course I will be diving into all the details when I cover it during the week of its launch. So if you're interested in that, make sure to subscribe down below. And also it does help out the channel and I really do appreciate it. Later this month, you can look forward to the next campaign being offered by Leader Games, and they're of course the publisher that brought you the game Root, along with a bunch of other games as well. There's going to be a new expansion for the game Oath, which is a really interesting concept. Just like Root, it is quite a lot to get to the table, but this one has a mechanism where the state of the end of the game is going to impact the way that your next game plays. So really interesting kind of legacy element there that doesn't really have the legacy aspect of destroying your components. But this one should be launching on May 28th. And then finally, I did just want to mention something that I've seen come up in the news a little bit now, and I think it's pretty interesting. But Neurolink's first human patient is now able to use his brain in order to play games like Slay of the Spire. And I also saw that he was able to play Mario Kart as well, along with a bunch of other games. It actually looks like it lists them out all here. But this is a really impressive accomplishment because this patient is a quadriplegic, so he's now able to do things that weren't even possible before, which is pretty amazing because he's now able to engage with his friends and family and people that are important to him in brand new ways. I think this is pretty cool because these science fiction developments always sound a little out there and a little bit difficult to grasp, and we always kind of wonder the impact that they'll have on society. And also just sounds a little weird and scary to get a chip implanted into your brain, and I think a lot of us wouldn't want to have that. But then I think this sort of news brings in quite a contrast to that, seeing how it can bring such a positive impact to someone's life. And when you actually see how these things change someone's life in such a big way, I think there might be some hope for humanity if there ever is an AI apocalypse. Other than that, I do always like to give a quick mention to Alex over at BoardGameCo because him and I do work together keeping track of all these campaigns, and I put together these videos every single week letting you know of any new developments. But Alex puts out a video at the start of each month letting you know of the heavy hitters for that month, and he already put up his video for the month of May, and he also started putting out a new video as well where he does a retrospective on the previous month, and he just posted that up as well. So if you want to see some of his favorite games that he played over the last month and some of his disappointments as well, you'll definitely want to check that one out. That's all I got for an intro, and we do got quite a lot of games launching this week, and I am also filming this video a little bit later than usual, so I apologize if this one goes up a little bit late today, but I normally do try to film this Friday night, but I wasn't able to, so I'm doing this Saturday morning, so let's just get into it. And these first couple campaigns I have covered in the past, and the first one is Guns of the Old West, and this one's going to be launching on May 13th. But this one is a Western-themed game that offers a bunch of different ways that you can play the game, and it also does have a campaign mode as well. But like I said, I did already cover this one in the past, but it got pushed back until now, so I'll just go ahead and roll that previous footage for you now. And this one is a semi-cooperative Western sandbox-style game where players can play the game either in individual scenarios or as an overarching campaign. The game's going to be throwing players into all sorts of high-intensity action moments like train heists, bank robberies, and even gunfights, and players will be building up their own reputation as an infamous outlaw or as a reliable deputy of the law. There's also going to be a couple expansions that allow players to play as natives or military factions as well, but no matter how you play, there's always going to be a group objective and then your individual goals. And players can all win the game together by completing that grander objective. But of course, this is the Wild West and anything goes, and some of the players might rather just look after number one. This is a turn-based game where players are going to be using actions to move and interact with different areas of the board, and players will be able to attack NPCs as well as the other players. And combat in this game is resolved by rolling attack and defense dice, but of course that can be further augmented by your different stats and gear and the weapons that you choose to use. The game also offers 3 different types of cards called health, action, and time effect cards. You'll be able to use these in conjunction with some of the actions that you have available to you in order to augment those actions and either make them more powerful or have some additional effects. The game continues like this over a series of rounds with players performing their actions on their turn, trying to complete that overarching goal, but then also potentially trying to complete their own personal goals. And the personal goals don't always make you betray the other players, but a lot of them might, so it's going to be up to the players' decisions and the options available to them to decide if they want to work together as a team or if they want to betray everyone else and try to win alone. But don't forget that you might not be the only player choosing that route, and you don't always want your intentions to be known. But if you are interested in this one, you can check it out. I'll have links to the campaign in the description below, and you can also follow along to get a free gift added to your pledge. Also launching on the 13th, we have World of Kilforth, the fantasy quest games. And the reason that I have the actual campaign page pulled up here instead of the BGG page like I usually do is because this one's actually going to be including the whole collection, and there isn't really a BGG page for that. But this will include the Call of Kilforth, a fantasy quest game, as well as Shadows of Kilforth and Gloom of Kilforth. And their campaign page doesn't say a whole lot right now, but I did find this comment here in the comment section, and it says that they will also be including some of their other games like 1565, St. Elmo's Pay, as well as 1066, Tears to Many Mothers. And it does look like they're going to be using this campaign to liquidate their existing stock because the prices are going to be insanely discounted. It's going to ship out immediately after the campaign ends, but then of course the orders are limited to their existing stock. So if all of that sounds interesting to you, and if you're interested in this game, you'll definitely want to be checking this one out. And like I said, this is including games that they have already previously released, and I did already cover one of them, and lucky for me, all these games do play very similar to each other, so if you do want to see the differences, you can go ahead and check out the campaign or look into that yourself. But I'll go ahead and roll that previous footage for you now so you can get an idea on how all of these games play. And this is a cooperative game, but it's also the third in a series. The first one was Gloom of Kilforth with a rating of 7.6, and then we had Shadows of Kilforth that has a really nice 8.0. And I imagine that this one's going to have a similar rating to those because all 3 of these games do play fairly similar to each other, but they each bring something a little different to the table. And the way that this game works is that at the start of the game, you're going to be setting up a grid of cards in the center of the player area, and this is going to represent the world that you're going to be moving through. And each player is going to be choosing a class and a race, and you're going to be putting those 2 cards together to create your character. Then there's also going to be a deck of saga cards that players are going to be trying to play through in order to try and win the game. Each saga card is going to have a few different objectives that players are trying to achieve, and there's going to be different actions that you need to perform and different keywords that you're trying to collect as you move through the different locations and try to encounter different creatures or people that have those different keywords. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of cards put out on the table here, and the reason for that is that each location card is going to have a sort of terrain type, and that's going to be associated with one of these decks of cards. So whenever you move to one of those locations, you're going to be drawing a card from the associated deck. And depending on what you find there, you can choose to take a few different actions. You can either try to fight it, or you could try to influence it depending on what your skills are, or alternatively, you could try to sneak away. Each round does have a night phase that's going to make some of the locations a little bit more difficult, but you'll also be discovering different upgrades and allies that will help you throughout the game. As players progress through the saga cards and get closer and closer to the end, there is going to be a final encounter where you're going to be fighting a final boss for an epic finale. The game looks fantastic, and there's going to be quite a lot of variability because this board is randomly generated, as well as the different cards that you're going to encounter, and there's a ton of different classes and races that players can choose from. So every game will play quite a bit differently from the last, and this is a system that's been tried and true and people seem to really like. So if this seems like a game that you might be interested in, there's a ton of content out there already, and I think you can have a lot of confidence in this back. Launch on the 14th, we have Hannibal and Hamilcar, and this one is a head-to-head historical war game. And what's interesting about this campaign is that this is actually 2 games in one, because this is a reimplementation of the game Hannibal, but also a reimplementation of the game Hamilcar. And these are two games that do play very similar to each other, with Hamilcar originally being a reimplementation of Hannibal, but this new version is going to be offering you both versions of the game, and the board will be double-sided to facilitate that. Of course, there will be a bunch of other changes as well, with upgraded artwork and deluxeified components, and there are some changes to the way that the game also plays, because the original Hannibal only had one scenario that you play through, whereas this new version is going to be offering you a bunch of different scenarios of varying length that you can jump into if you want different types of games, or shorter or longer games. And this is an asymmetrical game because not only are players starting with different control over the different areas of the map, but each player is also going to have some different mechanisms that are specific to them, because at its core, this is a game that you're going to be driving your actions through the play of your cards. The game plays over a series of phases where at the start of each round, you're going to be gaining some new units into your supply, and then you're going to be drawing your strategy cards from your draw deck. Players will then be alternating turns, playing those cards either to spend the points that the card offers, and you can use these points to do things like deploy more units, move your units around on the board, activate your generals along with their units, or even flip these political control markers to the other side, which will give you more control over that region if you do have one of your units currently sitting on top of an opponent's political control token. But of course, each of these cards do also have some abilities on them as well, and you can instead use the card for that ability, but most of these abilities are conditional, so you do have to get the game into a certain state to be able to use those, which does make them a little bit more difficult to use, but they also are normally quite a lot more powerful. Once each player has played all of their cards, you're then going to be moving into the next phase where you're essentially evaluating the board, and players could potentially lose any of their units that they have in unfriendly spaces, and you can also lose different political control markers that don't connect back to any of the areas that you do control. But for each of your units that are in a more dangerous location, you're going to be rolling dice to determine if they are going to survive or not and be potentially removed from the board. But then after all of that is resolved, players are going to be calculating their overall control of the different regions, and then they're going to be taking the difference, and then the player on the lower end of that is going to be losing that many political control tokens from the board. If either player ends up in the situation and they don't have any tokens that they're able to remove, then they're going to be instantly losing the game. But Rome can also win the game if they control Carthage, and similarly, Carthage can also win the game if they control Rome, and these are specific areas on the board. But if neither of those things happen, then the game always does come to an end at the final round, and then at that point, it's just the player who has the most points. As always, I have a link to the campaign in the description below if you want to learn more, and you can follow along to get a free solo mode expansion added to your pledge. Also on May 14th, we have Rove, and this one is a cooperative strategy adventure game in a world rich with biodiversity. And this is going to be taking you on a grand adventure through an overarching campaign that's going to involve things like character development and leveling up, as well as a branching storyline that you're going to be experiencing through a series of encounters. These encounters are going to be taking you through a wide variety of different landscapes and environments, but each of them are going to be working very similar to each other, where you are going up against all sorts of different enemies and potentially bosses, and players are going to have to work together in order to fight back against the evil in the land. In order to do all this, players are going to have a bunch of different options at their disposal, because each of the characters will have their own class strengths and weaknesses, as well as their own special abilities that players will be able to take advantage of. But players will also have a whole bunch of different ability cards that do have multiple uses on those cards. And these are going to be in two different categories. There's going to be your A-class abilities and your B-class abilities, and you always get to use one of each anytime that you play these ability cards. But for each of them, you can only choose one of the two options on those cards. Of course, depending on the character that you're playing as, there might be a certain theme to these cards as you're playing throughout the game, but you're also going to have opportunities to gain new cards and swap these out for other upgraded versions. You'll always be playing two of these cards on your turn, but you're not only limited to those cards, because players also have their skill cards that you pretty much have free reign over as long as you meet the requirements to play them. And they're going to pretty much augment your ability cards or add to them in different ways. And the neat thing about these skill cards is that they are double-sided, so whenever you do play one, you actually flip it to the other side, which is going to give other possibilities to you as the player, and you might have reason to want to flip them or not want to flip them, depending on what your plan is for the next turn. These skill cards do also have some other uses as well, because there are some reaction skill cards that allow you to react to different events or to enemies attacking you on their turn. Of course, in a rich, diverse world, there's lots of other things you'll be able to discover, and there's a whole variety of items that you'll be able to find and equip throughout the game. These, of course, can allow you to deal additional damage, heal yourself, help yourself in different ways, or even support your team. But after all the players have had their turn, it's going to be moving into the enemies phase, where each of them have a variety of different actions that they can perform. And the way that you determine this is simply by drawing a chip from a bag, and then depending on the value of that chip, it's going to determine which of the actions is going to be activated for that enemy. A really neat aspect of this game that I think will add a ton of fun into it is that there's also something known as the elemental track. And this track can change depending on the actions of the players and the enemies, but depending on which elements are active in that track or which elements are dominant, it can actually increase the power of certain attacks or even possibly nullify different attacks. So timing your abilities with what's on the elemental track, or even trying to modify that track to set up for a certain combo, is something that the players are able to do, and I think that creates a lot of opportunities for feeling really clever and feeling rewarded for proper planning. So if this one does sound interesting to you, you can go ahead and check it out, and I'll have it linked in the description down below. Also on the 14th, we have Masters of the Universe Battleground, and the first thing I want to say about this one is if you're not interested in the He-Man theme, you still might want to check this one out, because this is a game that's been out for a while now and it's been getting a ton of positive reviews, and after looking through it myself, I think this one does look like a ton of fun. And I am personally a little adverse to IP on games, although I am known to dabble occasionally, but even I am tempted to back this one because it does look like a really solid skirmish game. But this is a game of good versus evil, where one player is going to be playing as He-Man and the other player is going to be playing as Skeletor, and then also playing as all the associated characters on those teams. Each of the characters on the team will also come with their own unique abilities and limitations or advantages of which weapons and items they can use, because what's really interesting about this game is that you can actually customize each of your characters with different gear, items, spells, and weapons according to the amount of skill points that you're able to spend for that character. This is really cool because it introduces a ton of variety into the game with the variety that you can have with your characters, but then of course the different terrain that you can put out on the board with all of their varying effects as well and their relative positions to each other is also going to massively change up the battlefield. So this is a game that just offers a ton of different experiences. That doesn't just stop there, because players will also each have their own deck of 20 cards that they're going to be using to control their various units out on the board. And what's really neat about the way that the card play works in this game is that you're always going to be drawing 5 on your turn, and then players are going to be simultaneously playing 1 in order to determine who goes first, because each of these cards do have an initiative value, and the higher value is going to be the player that goes first. But when it is your turn, you can actually play as many of those cards that you want on any of the characters that you want. You could split them up amongst your different characters, or you could play all of them with a single character if that is what you think is the most advantageous play. Each of the cards here will grant you with a number of action points that you'll be able to spend to perform your actions, like moving or attacking or activating any special abilities of that character, but then they can also grant you with mana points as well, which are normally used to reroll your dice, because combat in this game is done through dice rolling, but the mana here does offer you some dice mitigation. Each of the cards can come with a special ability as well, and often do offer you some sort of choice and flexibility as how you want to apply that action. And of course, there's all sorts of tokens and items that you can pick up out on the board in order to add even more options to your arsenal. In addition to the 5 action cards that you're going to be drawing each round, each player is also going to have 2 special cards that you always have in your hand until you decide to use them. These can also grant you with additional action points or mana, and also a special ability as well. But the main purpose of these cards is that if you're able to fulfill them and use them properly, then they will also grant you with a ton of points, which is how you do determine the winner of this game. Of course, there's a variety of other ways to gain victory points as well through completing smaller objectives or wiping out your opponent's units. And of course, this campaign is going to be introducing a bunch of new deluxified upgrades and stretch goals that are going to be exclusive to this campaign. So if you're interested in this game and you're interested in all those extra upgrades, definitely check this one out, and I will have it linked in the description down below. Also on the 14th, we have Dark Omen, which is a cooperative campaign adventure where players are going to be playing through a series of scenarios with each of them introducing new aspects of the story, telling you how to set up that particular scenario, and then also each of them can have their own win or loss conditions and different goals that you might be trying to complete along the way. Of course, depending on how well you perform on that scenario, it's going to be leading you to either a positive or a negative outcome, which can dictate the future of the story. But throughout this game, you're going to be trying to manage a few different things to try and complete those goals. And there's also going to be a darkness track, which can grant you with different positive benefits if you keep it on the lighter end of that track. But if everything goes completely dark, then that is another way that you can lose a scenario. But the board's broken up into 4 different regions that are going to be coming into play in various aspects of the game. Something that is really interesting and unique about this board is that you have this triple layered disc located in the center that you can actually modify by sliding these 2 different tabs. And what this determines is where the darkness is rolling through at the various points in the game. Of course, moving through the darker areas represent different obstacles that the players are going to have to deal with while they move around out on the board, and moving through those areas is going to cost you more action points. So you want to try and manipulate the board in such a way that your players have more action points to spend on other actions that might help them with your objectives. Of course, there's going to be a lot more out on the board than what you're seeing here because there's going to be a bunch of different tokens that players can pick up for different items or resources that they can craft into items. And there's also going to be different locations and special locations that all offer different actions available to the players when they are located there. And players will be able to take advantage of this to do some basic things, but also some special things for that scenario. But each scenario plays over 4 chapters, which you're going to be tracking with these tokens in the center of the board. And at the start of each chapter, you're going to be triggering scenario-specific omens by drawing a number of omen cards from the omen deck. These are going to have a bunch of negative effects to the players, doing different things like spawning enemies out on the board. But after you've done all that, each of the players is going to be drawing these rune tokens from the rune bag and then rolling them out on the table. And depending on the rune and the color that you get, that's going to be determining which cards that you get during that specific chapter. These cards represent different modifiers that could be positive or negative to your player, and they're just going to introduce a little bit of variability and different opportunities or obstacles that you are all going to have to deal with as a team. But after all of this is done, players are going to be able to spend their action points in order to perform various actions out on the board, in order to move around on the board, pick up various tokens that might be at their current location, or even perform special scenario-specific or location-specific actions, depending on where they are located out on the board. But something that's interesting about the way that players perform actions in this game is that when they do perform an action, they're going to be moving their player's colored token up on this track, and each player can only get so far ahead until they have to wait for the other players to catch up with their actions, which means that if you use all your actions right away, you're not going to be able to do much until your other players catch up. So this is both a mechanism that balances the actions amongst the players, but also determines when the next chapter of that round is going to occur, because once all the players have made it to that specific location on this track, that's going to be triggering the next chapter, and you're going to be going through all that sequence events over again and dealing with the new omen cards that appear. As players move around this track and move through the different chapters, you're also going to be moving into a night phase, which can have different effects on the game depending on the scenario or depending on the cards that the players have. Then if you're able to reach the very end of the final chapter, then you're going to be going up against a final boss. Combat in this game is done using dice rolling, but of course you'll be able to use any of the items and gear that you found in order to help you in those battles. And in order to determine if you've landed a hit or dealt damage, or if you took damage, you're going to be comparing the results of your rolls to your opponents. The game continues like this until the scenario resolves based on its win or loss conditions, and then the players will be able to move into the next scenario. And if you are interested in this one, you can check it out. I'll have it linked in the description down below. And launching on May 14th, we have the Amsterdam board game Season 1, which is going to be the first of many seasons to come. And this one is really interesting because this all started by just a group of people getting together over the love of board games and starting to share their designs, playtest each other's designs. And now it's come this far where they're able to start these Kickstarter campaigns to try and get those off the ground. And this first season is going to be offering 3 different lighter weight games, and I'll get into how each of those play in just a second here. But first I want to mention that this one is my own personal pick of the week. And I do have a couple reasons for that. First of all, I do think each of these games looks like a ton of fun, and I think they're really well designed and they're going to do a great job delivering the experience that they're going for. But the second thing is that this is just the type of thing that I love to see on Kickstarter. It's just a bunch of people getting new ideas and turning them into board games and doing the due diligence that they need to make sure that they're well play tested and that they are working on them to try and make them as fun as possible. I have already taken a look at their campaign page, and I think they did a fantastic job explaining how each of these games play, as well as offering them at very reasonable prices. And also, I just think the whole presentation and professionalism that they have with this page gives me a lot of trust in their ability to deliver and design good games. Dare I say, even more confidence than some of these bigger companies in the industry. But the 3 games being offered in this campaign are going to be Grachtenpand, Bable, and Timezoo, and I'll just go through each of these with the first one being Grachtenpand, which is a competitive set collection game, and I am normally not a huge fan of set collection, but this is actually the one that I'm most interested in because I think they did such a fantastic job with this. And it looks like a really fun game that I am really interested in backing. This is a game that involves card drafting where players are going to be using their cards to build a sequence of buildings in a Dutch canal. Each of these buildings is going to be composed of a shop, some amount of floors for housing, and then capping it all off with a rooftop. Players can build their buildings of varying heights, and each of the cards can come in a variety of different colors, but each of the cards in the center of your building are going to have a number of items that you can score on. This could be cats, flowers, flags, or even the seagulls, and some of these items can actually detract from your score as well, depending on how you set your building up. But getting back to why I don't normally like set collection games is because it often just feels very random to me without a whole lot of choice or decision making. And this is a reason that I'm not a big fan of Sushi Go, because I feel like you're drafting cards, but your ability to score those cards depends on the decisions of the other players, but you don't actually know that decision until you've already drafted your cards, since you all simultaneously reveal, which to me just seems very, very random, and you're just given an illusion of choice at the start of the game, and then you're just trying to get cards that fulfill those scoring conditions that you're now locked into. But if one player happened to pick a card that no one else picked, then they have a lot more opportunity than the rest of you, so that game left my collection pretty quickly. But what I really love about the way that this game handles its set collection is that the storefront you choose, along with the rooftop you choose, are going to be determining the scoring for that building. This means that although you are still drafting, it's up to you to decide how you want to create those scoring opportunities. And you also have an opportunity at the end of building your building to add additional scoring parameters. Not only does this give you more flexibility and decisions with your set collection, but also all the cards that go into the center of your building are also all going to be useful to you in some way. You'll be able to put that card into any one of your buildings that you haven't put a rooftop on yet, which also introduces a bit of a push your luck mechanism of when you actually want to cap that off and score those victory points, because the end of the game is also triggered as soon as a player finishes their 4th building. So you do want to make these as tall as possible in order to score as much as you can, but you don't want to spend too much time there and let someone else end the game while you still haven't completed your buildings. Really love what I'm seeing with this one. I think this is a great example of a game that will appeal to both gamers as well as people new to board gaming. The second game offered in this campaign is called Bable, and this one is also one that I am very interested in because this is actually a cooperative game where players are trying to work together in order to build the Tower of Babel. The problem here is that each of the players are all speaking a different language, and this is going to be represented by the 4 cards that players have in their hand. Each of them are going to be associated with a different action. The different actions offered here are going to allow players to do different things like draw additional resources into their hand, play those resources down into a shared pool, and then of course there is an action to use those resources in order to build one of the sections of the tower. The catch here is that each player is going to be taking turns as the foreman or the master builder who's going to be directing the other players as to what they need to do. and in order to make them do a particular action, you need to say the appropriate word in their language that's associated with that action. This is going to incorporate a little bit of memory as you figure out the different words of the players, and if you happen to say the wrong word that might be associated with a different action, then you're going to get them to do something very different. But if you say something that is not on any of their cards, then they're not going to be able to do anything. But of course, languages are always changing and developing, and you're going to have to keep up with that because after each player's turn, they're going to be drawing a new word card into their hand, and if that card already has an action that they already have on one of their other cards, then they're going to have to discard that older card, which means that players are always going to have to keep up with the different words that the players all understand and try and remember what those are and hopefully try to forget the ones that are no longer relevant. If the players can successfully work together to build up the entire tower before that word deck runs out, then they win the game. And the last game offered in this campaign is called Timezoo, and this one is also a competitive set collection game. This one's a little different than the first one because, well, it does play a lot differently, but it's also going to incorporate more of those take that elements. The way this game plays is that each player is going to have their own character card that's going to give them some special advantages, but then players are competing to lure dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures back into their zoo. On a turn, players will be able to draw additional food cards into their supply, or they can use those food cards to lure a particular animal, with each animal having a different diet or requirements that they need in order to be attracted to your zoo. Each of these cards can grant you with victory points or different scoring conditions that might require you to get more or other types of cards in order to combo those scoring potentials, but each of these cards could also grant you with some special abilities as well that you can use to help yourself or potentially hinder your opponents. Player with the most victory points at the end of the game wins the game, and if you're interested in any of these, definitely go ahead and check them out, and I'll have a link to their campaign in the description below, and you can get any or all of these games, and like I said, they are all offered at a very reasonable price, so I do recommend taking a look at what they have to offer. And also on the 14th, we have the Thinning Veil Cormac Mac Airt on the other side of midnight, and hopefully I said all that correctly, but it took me a second to figure out what exactly this campaign is, and now that I figured that out, I do want to say that I really do love what I'm seeing here. This is a brand new game in the Thinning Veil world, and the Thinning Veil is a campaign that I did cover in the past. Unfortunately, they weren't able to fund, and I think a reason for that is because it was quite expensive. It was offering a lot. And of course, for a mostly rational backer, we probably want to have as much confidence as possible before shelling out a whole whack of money for a game. But I think the publisher here recognized that, and they are now offering a more low-cost version for players to get their feet wet with what this game does have to offer. So this new campaign is actually offering a brand new game into the world, and they're also offering it at a much more reasonable price and also offering print and play versions as well. And they will go ahead and relaunch this game in the future. But what I really like about this sequence that they're taking here is that you can experience the game with this first more inexpensive campaign, and then if you absolutely love what they're offering here, you can go ahead and get the entire larger box game that does play at a higher player count, because the version that they're offering in this campaign is actually a solo game. But I think this approach here really speaks wonders to their confidence in the game and their pride in it by offering a more pared down version to help more people experience that game, which I am personally a massive fan of. I always think any publisher should try to figure out ways to offer their games to as many people as possible. Sure, offering all those deluxifications and ton of expansions, but then also offering something that's a little bit more reasonable. I know this does come with additional overhead, and I understand why it isn't always done, but I feel like most of the reason that this isn't done is because big publishers just want you to spend as much as possible. But what Triskelion Games is doing here does make me really happy, and I hope this sets the example for what's possible for other publishers in the industry. And I know it's not always required depending on the scale of your game, but doing anything to raise your backers' confidence and giving them the opportunity to experience your game, whether it's through print and play files or pared down versions of your game, Tabletop Simulator, providing the rulebook in advance, or even just offering a variety of reviews from different reviewers. There's a lot that can be done here, and I feel like a lot of those options just aren't normally explored. But like I said, I did cover the previous campaign, and I did think this game looked like a lot of fun, so I'll go ahead and roll that footage for you now. Just keep in mind that this campaign is going to be a more paired version of that and offering just the solo experience. But if you are interested in it, I will have it linked in the description down below. This is a narrative campaign game, but it can also be played as one-shot scenarios. scenarios, and this is a cooperative game. This is going to have a theme that is in the horror genre, but focuses on Celtic mythology and Irish legend. And the way that this game plays is that each player is going to be playing as their own asymmetrical character, and you're going to be able to choose a scenario to play, or if you're playing the campaign mode, it's going to walk you through the scenarios in sequential order. But essentially, each game you're going to be playing through a multi-level dungeon where you're going to be starting on a specific tile, and then you're going to be randomly generating tiles as you progress and move through the dungeon until you go through all the different levels and eventually face off against a final boss. And the final boss could be hordes and hordes of enemies, or it could also be a specific monster that's just way stronger than the rest, or even a combination of the two. But this is a game that uses dice in almost every aspect, and as players are exploring the different tiles, you're going to be rolling dice to determine what appears there, and that could be different enemies or different points of interest like items or skill checks that players are going to have to pass. And as you are killing these different enemies, you're going to be collecting those souls, which you could spend to help you later in the game. But the thing that I find is the most interesting aspect of this game, and I think what sets it apart from other dungeon crawlers, is the way that the player boards work. Each player is going to be choosing their asymmetrical character and then sliding it into this dashboard. And on the bottom you have the different stats of your character, and you're essentially going to be adding cubes to each of the different stats, which you'll be able to spend or you might gain or lose throughout the game. But your stats generally mean your capacity for that specific stat. So if you're a berserker, you might be really high in health but really low in faith. And there'll be different opportunities to use each of these stats either for skill checks or fighting or any other actions that you might perform out on the main board. But my favorite part about this board is the way the actions play into it, and all the actions are outlined on the right hand side of the board. And at the start of your turn, you're going to be rolling dice that have all those different icons matching the actions. And whichever icons you roll, you're going to be adding an activation cube to each of those associated actions. This is going to let you know which actions you have available on your turn, except for this final action, which is the enemy activation space. And any cubes that go into there are going to activate the enemies. And the reason that I find this so interesting is because it means you're not necessarily going to have the same actions available to you every single turn. Since you're rolling dice, you're going to have to roll with the punches and sometimes just do the best with what you have available to you. Luckily, there is some mitigation and there is some ways to control this, because if there's any actions that aren't particularly useful on your turn, you can actually slide them over to the left side of the board and bank those for a future turn. So you can guarantee that you have that available to you on your next turn. But since this does involve dice rolling, there is always a chance that you just roll a ton of enemy activations on your turn, which isn't a great thing, but you can always choose to skip your turn and ignore all results of the dice, but there will always be one enemy activation if you decide to go that route. And the game continues like this until the players reach the final boss, and if they beat the boss, then they win the game. And if you're interested in this game or any other that I have to mention in this video, you can find links in the description below. Also on the 14th, we have Good Dog, Bad Zombie, and this one is a cooperative game in a zombie apocalypse. But rather than playing as the humans trying to survive, you are all playing as different breeds of dogs with your own special abilities depending on your breed, and it's up to you to try and save mankind. And what's really interesting about this game is the way that the theme is just incorporated into all the aspects of the game on the cards and on the board, with everything being provided through the eyes of a dog. The goal of the game is to try and save as many humans by getting them to Central Bark, but there is also a feral track that's going to be increasing whenever something undesirable happens. So if a human gets eaten or a zombie enters Central Bark, then this is going to be moving that token up the feral track. And if the players all go feral before the end of the game, then you're not able to save the humans and you will be losing the game. But the way this game works is that on your turn you can perform 2 actions, and there's a few basic actions that you can perform. You can move around on the board, you can lick other dogs that you're near in order to gain energy in the form of energy cards, and you can also sniff to pick up various tokens. One of those 2 actions could be to play any cards that you currently have in your possession. These are going to be giving you more powerful abilities, like the ability to herd a figure, which I believe would be people, zombies, or even other dogs, in order to move them into a direction you want them to go, or keep them away from things that you don't want them to be near. You can also bark to push any of the units near you away from you, and you can also chew in order to remove a zombie. The zoom card gets you an additional action, and then of course there is the good dog card that allows you to activate your special ability. This of course is the most powerful action that you can perform, and like I said, each of the dog breeds are going to have their own special ability to take advantage of. But if the players are able to get the humans to central bark and then also not go feral before they're able to do so, then they win the game. And if you're interested to check this one out, I will have it linked down below. Also on the 14th, we have Escape Death Race 2182 Micro, and this is a competitive racing and fighting game where players are going to be trying to fight each other as well as monsters to hopefully be the last player standing and win the race. And what's nice about this game is that it all fits into this handy tin. But of course, the campaign will be offering you a bunch of deluxified components and individual cards that players will be able to use as they play through the game. But no matter which card you're playing as, you're always going to start with 20 health, and then you're also going to have your own unique ability. And what's neat about this game is that not only are you moving around trying to take advantage of your abilities and fight the other players and monsters, but you're also building the track through tile placement as you play the game. On a player's turn, they're going to be drawing and placing those road tiles to create a path for yourself, or try to inhibit your opponents by surrounding them with traps or hazards, and then you'll be able to move your card. Depending on the tile that you move onto, it might grant you additional movement. You might be able to pick up different weapons and power cards that you can also play on your turn or in a future turn, and you can also trigger different events where you'll be drawing an event from the event deck. But of course, there are also those traps and hazards that you'll want to avoid, and if you're not able to, then they can inflict some amount of damage. But anytime that you land on a monster card, you'll be able to fight that monster, and the monster always deals their damage first unless you're able to block it with some sort of ability or card that you might have. But then you'll be able to roll and play cards to deal damage back to that monster. All 4 monsters need to be defeated in order to win the game, but you also need to be the last player standing amongst all the players, so if there's no monsters left, you're going to be fighting each other. The game continues like this until that condition is met, and if you're interested in this one, you can check it out. I'll have it linked down below. Also on the 14th, we have Hunted Mining Colony 415, the second edition, and this is a solo game in the Hunted series that also incorporates dexterity elements. And the way that this game works is that there's going to be a deck of cards that players are drawing from, and you're going to be drawing different things like items, survivors, and corridors, and each of those will come with a cost that if you want to purchase them, you need to pay that cost in order to take it into your hand. The way that you pay that cost is by matching the icons to other cards that you also drew, because every time you draw a card, it's going to be going into this row that is expanding until you either decide to rest or until you win or lose the game. But when you do purchase one of the cards, you're going to be taking that into your hand, and then the cards that you use to pay for it are going to be discarded. The actions will grant you with one-time use ability cards, whereas the survivors will act as a permanent ability, usually allowing you to have free access to a certain icon that you can use for paying for those various costs. And then the corridors are required in order to draw a location from the location deck, which is the main thing that you're trying to do in this game, because once you get through that entire deck and survive, then you win the game. The catch here is that each of those location cards will have an effect when they are visible, and they're normally not very good for the player. But aside from the items, survivors, and corridors, there's also enemy cards that you can draw from that main deck. And whenever they come out, they're not necessarily going to attack you right away, because they only attack you if there are 2 enemy cards or if there are 2 noise icons. And the noise icons are going to be appearing on those various items, which means that you might want to purchase an item just to get those items out of the row in order to try and put yourself in a better position if an enemy does show. The enemies can come with a different amount of strength and also have different effects on the player as well. But like I said, if you do have an enemy in your row that you really don't want to deal with and you haven't been forced into battle yet, you can always rest in order to clear that entire row of cards, losing any of those items, but also gain rid of the enemies as well. The catch here is that doing that also progresses the time track, and there's other actions that can progress it as well, but if you ever run out of time, that is another way that you can lose the game. As I said, this is a second edition of the game, and it does introduce a few changes, and a couple of those do affect the way that combat works. And like I said, this does incorporate dexterity elements, but one of the new changes is that it is going to be offering you a way to play this without dexterity, if that's something that you're not a huge fan of. But if you choose to fight using the dexterity element, the way this works is that you're going to have this card in the box of the game, and then you're going to be choosing how much ammunition you want to use from one of your weapons, and you always do start with a base weapon, and then you're going to be taking those associated tokens and then tossing them into the box, trying to get them to touch or be in the circle on your enemy. Anytime you do that, it counts as a hit, and if you can deal enough damage, then you will wipe that enemy from the row. But of course, the enemies will also be dealing damage back at you, especially if you're not able to defeat them, and anytime that happens, you're going to be losing health, and if you run out of health, that's another way to lose the game. But this new version of the game also introduces a damaged element where you'll be drawing a damaged card, and then that's going to be adding something to make the combat or some aspect of the game more difficult until you are able to heal. The new version also introduces an event deck and a new test system that's going to be improving the overall pace of the game. And if you are interested in this one, you can go ahead and check it out, and I'll have it linked in the description down below. Also on the 14th, we have Feudum, the Septennial edition, because this is the 7th anniversary of the game. And this is a giant competitive area control and guild control game where you're going to be placing out units out on a board in order to gain influence over different areas. But the cool thing about this is that as you're placing those influence markers out, you also get to choose which side of that marker is face up, which is going to dictate which of the guilds you're going to be gaining influence over. The game plays over 5 eras, which are each triggered by the actions of the players. And one thing I do want to say about this is that this is a large game that has a ton of rules, a ton of components, and it can be a little fiddly. But if you are not adverse to that, this is a game that a lot of people like. And I know this is probably the pick of the week of one of my really good friends because I know this is her favorite game of all time. And with all that being said, I'll try to explain the game in just a few minutes here, but if you want to know the actual rules, just make sure that you have your drinks and food ordered in advance. But this is a game that plays over a series of rounds, and each player is going to have 11 action cards that they're going to be using to perform the various actions in the game. Every round, you're going to be choosing 4 of those to play, and then after those 4 cards are chosen, players are going to be playing 1 card in turn order. You can use a card to pay resources in order to deploy one of your units out on the board, and like I said, you can choose which of the faces that you want on the top, which is going to influence which guilds you have control over. And if you want to move your units, there is a card for that as well, and it'll allow you to move your units through land, air, or sea, but you need to meet the requirements and have access to the proper vessel in order to do so. You can add an influence marker to one of the areas where you currently have a unit, and the player that has the most in a location is going to be the ruler of that location, which will grant them with a bunch of different benefits. And if you feel like you've secured that location well enough, you can also upgrade a location to swap its token for a better one. And this is where the name comes from, because the best and final upgrade you can get is the Feudum. And this is going to give you all sorts of special benefits, but in order to get full advantage of it, it also requires you to engage in a certain amount of conflict each and every round. If you're not able to meet that quota, you can actually lose victory points. When it comes to battle, there's also cards that you can play in order to boost your attack or defense. And then there's also a card that you can play in order to gain additional cards, which could be upgrades or bonuses or end game scoring. There's also an action that gains you money or resources, or an action to use a guild power. And whenever you do that, you'll be able to trade with any of the guilds out on the board. And each of these guilds do work very different from each other, but a really interesting aspect with these guilds is that each one can also interact with the guild that's adjacent to them. And the different guilds could offer you different resources or allow you to spend resources in order to make wine or gain additional influence markers, or even recruit various monsters offered in the game that you'll be able to deploy and take advantage of to try and defeat your opponents. If you are the one in control of a guild, you can also use an action to manipulate the resources between that guild and its adjacent guilds. And this will allow you to take or give resources depending on your objective at that time. Of course, there's other actions and a ton of other ways to score victory points in this game, and you can even go out on little adventures and things like that. But this new version of the game is going to be upgrading a bunch of aspects of the game with improved graphic design, which was a complaint of this game. And that's just going to make this game a little bit easier to play, which is something that's really great to have, especially when you do have this grandiose of a game. I'm also seeing a lot of reference on the campaign page for a 6th player, but when I go to check the player count, it says 1 to 5. So I think this is going to be adding a 6th player, but it's not really explicitly stated, so it's a little unclear. But there are going to be some rulebook corrections, and of course, a bunch of deluxified components as well. There's a whole What's New section showing off some of these new components and mentions to the 6th player, but I'll just scroll through this and you can check out exactly what it's offering, but that is pretty much the main new additions to the game. And if you're interested to learn more, definitely go ahead and check out the campaign page, but this is one that I would recommend trying to try before you buy if you are able to do so. But Like I said, check it out, and if you're interested, you can follow along to get a free gift added to your pledge. Also on the 14th, we have a campaign that's not exactly for a game, but it's something to help you store your games, and this is the colorful inserts provided by E-Raptor. And there's going to be a bunch of specific games that they're providing these inserts for, and I'm sure they'll also be offering any for their previous campaigns. But if you are interested to see what the actual inserts look like, definitely go ahead and check out their campaign page, but they do have some images on their Facebook as well, with Here Being Perch, Brass Birmingham, Earth, and a ton of others as well. Not really much more to say on this one, but you can go ahead and check it out, and I'll have it linked in the description down below. It looks like this campaign actually just launched today, but this one is Whispers of Whitechapel. And this one is a deduction murder mystery role-playing game where one player is going to be playing as an investigator, trying to discover which of the other players, who are all playing as suspects, is Jack the Ripper. And this is a game that plays over a series of days, where the first day you're going to be introducing your characters and any observations of their daily routine. And then each of the following days after that, you're going to be providing additional information about what you've done during that day, probably trying to convince the investigator that you are not the murderer. But on day 3, that murder is actually going to occur, and in between each day, the investigators can make certain decisions to set the direction of the following days, but they also have additional information and clues that they can take advantage of. But Jack the Ripper also has the opportunity to add twists and make it more difficult for that investigator. If you're interested to learn more, I do have this one linked down in the description below, and of course you can go ahead and back it now because it has already launched. And this next one is one that I just found out about, so I just quickly did a little bit of research here, but this one is a take-that game where players are going to have a number of hexes on them that they're trying to cure in order to win the game. The problem is that each time you cure one of your hexes, that has a number of side effects which could make it easier for the other players to harm you or play additional hexes onto you that you're then going to also have to cure. But the first player that's able to cure all their hexes wins the game, and if you want to check out more, I will have it linked down below. And on the 17th, we have the 7 Seas, and this one is a competitive game where players are going to be sailing their ship around to different locations and scoring points in different ways. But this one is a campaign that I did cover in the past, but it got pushed back until now. But I thought this one looked like a lot of fun, and it's definitely worth checking out. But I'll just go ahead and roll that previous footage for you now. And if you want to learn more about this one, I will have it linked down below. And this is a competitive worker placement game where players are each going to have their own ship out on the board, and then players are going to have 2 workers to perform their actions. Players are going to be taking turns placing 1 worker at a time, and there's 4 main actions in the game, but you're actually going to be taking 2 at a time, because every time you place your worker, you're going to be able to perform the 2 actions beside your worker in any order that you choose. And I'll just go through what each of those actually do, but the main one is to actually move your ship, and you'll be able to move your ship equal to the amount of movement points that you have for your ship, which you can upgrade by getting more sails onto your own personal player board. You can continue to move up to that many movement points or choose to stop whenever you like, but anytime that you move through a tile that doesn't already have a card revealed beside it, then you're going to be revealing one of those cards, and each of the tiles will have their own deck of cards associated with it. You can also spend your movement points in order to redraw a card if you don't like the one that you got. But if you happen to draw an encounter card, or if you end up moving to a tile that has an encounter card, then you have to stop immediately and you have to resolve that encounter. And I'll come back to how the encounters work, but first let's explain the other 3 actions, because if you stop your movement at a port card, then you can use the port action that allows you to exchange resources for other resources. But if you stopped at a tile with an island card, then you can use the action to explore the island, which will allow you to roll dice in order to try and get the number of stars depicted on that card in order to gain the associated resources. And you always do get 1 die for free, but you'll be able to spend your red cubes in order to add additional dice to your rolls, increasing your chance of success. Final action allows you to either upgrade or repair your ship, but you can only choose to do one of those each time that you perform this action, and you can upgrade your ship by purchasing more sails to increase its movement, or by adding more cannons to increase its firepower. In order to heal your ship, you're going to be repairing any of the planks that you might have lost. And the nice thing about all of this is that the better condition and more upgraded your ship is at the end of the game will be earning you victory points. You can also gain victory points by successfully completing a card at each of the different locations, but you can only do this once per location. You're going to be indicating this on your player board by adding the token to the associated location in the top left corner of your player board. You do also get to keep any of the cards that you completed, and you're going to be storing them on the right hand side of your board here. And for each type that you're able to get 4 or more of, that's going to be gaining you 2 victory points at the end of the game. This means that not only do you want to complete a card at each of the individual locations, but you also want to have an even distribution of the types of cards that you're completing in order to maximize the victory point potential. But like I said, anytime that you're on a tile that has an encounter card revealed beside it, you're going to have to resolve that encounter, and each of these cards is going to have an amount of health indicated in the bottom left corner of the card. And then there's going to be a number of stats in either cannonballs or swords, and there can also be these question mark squares, which mean that you're going to have to roll a die to determine what stat that's going to be. And if you don't want to fight the encounter, you can always avoid it by spending a certain amount of resources, but if you're not able to do that, or if you simply don't want to, then you're going to be resolving the encounter by using dice rolling and rolling a combat die for each of the cannons that you have on your own personal ship. These dice will also be gaining you a number of cannonballs or swords, but you're going to be resolving the cannonballs first. And the way that this works is that you're going to be inflicting the number of cannonballs worth of damage against the card, and it's also going to be inflicting damage on you equal to the amount of cannonballs it has. But if you're able to inflict enough damage to completely wipe out its health, then you have defeated that card and you get to claim it and gain the benefits. But if neither you or the opponent were defeated, then you're going to be continuing to resolve the battle by comparing the number of swords. And it's simply the ship that has the most swords that wins at this point, with ties favoring the opponent's ship. And if you lose here, not only did you take that hit in your health, but you also do have to give up a portion of your resources. But if you're able to defeat the ship, then you will get the resources depicted on that card. But the game continues like this over a series of rounds, and then the player with the most victory points at the end of the game wins the game. And if you are interested in this one, you can check it out. I'll have it linked down below. Also on the 17th, we have Vendarla, and this one is a competitive push your luck game where players are going to be trying to collect item cards as well as the required resources to build those items, because each of those items is going to be awarding you with the amount of victory points that will help you be the winner at the end of the game. Players are going to be starting the game with 2 item cards as well as some starting gold, but then players will be taking turns doing either one of 2 things. You can either draw resources from the resource deck. Whenever you do this, you're going to be drawing into a tableau of cards, and you can stop anytime you want, because this is where the push your luck aspect comes into play, because there are a bunch of monsters in that deck, and if you ever get 2 monsters drawn, then you could bust, and I'll come back to that in a second here. But ideally, you want to stop before you ever draw 2 monsters, because whenever you do, you're going to have first dibs on anything that you've drawn, and you're just going to have to pay the cost to take that into your supply. But then each of the other players is going to have an opportunity to purchase one of these cards as well, but they'll have to pay you a premium of 1 additional coin. This means that not only are you trying to get the cards that you want, but you also want to draw enough cards to allow other players to buy from that pool so that you're getting extra money. But if you do bust, it's not necessarily the end of your turn, because you do have the option to fight back if you have the appropriate item or companion. And the way that you get these is your second option on your turn, and that's to purchase from the market. And you're pretty much seeing the whole market right here. There's a bunch of different items that you can buy, and they do give you more flexibility and freedom to push your luck if you do know you have a way to combat any enemies that might show up. The market is also where you're going to want to go in order to buy new blueprints for items to give you even more options for the resources that you're collecting, and the end of the game is triggered once 3 of the premium items are built, which are more costly to build, but as soon as a player builds 3 of those, they're going to be getting those victory points, but then also triggering the end of the game. And then at the end of the game, the player with the most victory points wins. And if you are interested in this one, you can go ahead and check it out, and I'll have it linked in the description down below. And that's everything I have for you this week, but don't leave yet, because we've still got a couple awesome giveaways to announce, and these are the easiest giveaways to ever. All you got to do is leave a comment down below. And also, both of these giveaways are games that I do plan on backing. I haven't backed them yet because, for the same reason that this video is going up late, I just haven't had the time to get caught up on all the different campaigns that I'm interested in. But I hope this also does make up for me posting this video a little later than usual, because these games are definitely ones that you'll want to check out. And this first one is for an all-in pledge for Ice Unlimited, which is a fantastic competitive game that also uses tile excavation, which is a really neat mechanism where you're going to have multi-layers of tiles, and then players are going to be using actions to dig up those tiles, with the tile actually granting you with a special action that you can spend on a later turn, or offering some other way to score victory points. The cool thing about this is that excavating a tile does cost a number of action points, but players are going to be moving different tokens out on the board, and there's going to be these shared tokens that can be used by any player, and any time that you excavate with another one of those tokens on your hex, each one of those tokens is going to reduce the cost by 1. This is a game that I have played in the past, and I really did like the game, and I wanted to keep it in my collection, but instead of doing that, I gave it to my brother just because I felt it was a little too long, and I did take some issues with the rulebook, but all of my concerns were addressed with this new version of the game. And even though my brother still owns the original version of this game, and I normally don't buy games that my siblings or friends own, I am still very tempted to go ahead and back this just to add it to my own collection. But I really love what the publisher did with this one, and it would have been much easier for them just to make a few rules tweaks and then release a second edition of the game, but instead they took all the feedback from their existing backers and improved the game, incorporating that feedback in such a way that I think this is going to be better for everyone. And if you do already own the original version of the game, they do also have a conversion kit that will allow you to play the game in both of its forms, and you can either go purchase the physical version of that, but they are offering a print and play version as well that you can just go ahead and grab off their campaign page. One other thing I want to mention is that with the changes they made, they also took that as an opportunity to reduce the overall cost to manufacture their game, which they also did forward onto the backers. So you are getting much better prices here for what I think is a better game. And the original game was already something that I had trouble letting go of. But like I said, this is for an all-in pledge, which is only going to make the experience even better here. And it comes with everything they have to offer, as well as a really nice insert. All you got to do to enter this giveaway is leave a comment down below with the hashtag ICE, and you can say anything that you want, but if you're looking for something in particular, I'm going to try and keep this one summer themed since we are getting into the hotter months of the year. But maybe you could let us know what your favorite ice cold beverage is. And for myself, it's tempting to go with a daiquiri or a margarita, but I got to go with that extra dirty martini because I love olives and I actually do like the taste of vodka. And I know that might sound crazy, but when you chill vodka enough, it just gets way more smooth for whatever reason. So if you haven't tried a martini, I do recommend it. Just keep in mind it is pretty much straight vodka, so you might want to have your next morning clear. And for the next giveaway, we have the Lightspeed Arena, which is another game that I will probably end up backing here. And this giveaway is going to be for the Ace Pledge, which comes with the base game as well as both expansions. But this is a really simple but really cool game where every round players are going to be able to put down one tile out onto the table, and each of the tiles that you're putting down are going to have some sort of spaceship on them, and you're going to be using that ship to try and complete different objectives but also defeat your opponents. Each of the ships can have a different amount of strength and also different shields that you're going to be trying to position in just the right way to protect you from any of your opponent's tiles. But after all the tiles are placed, you're going to be activating each of those ships in initiative order indicated by the value of that ship. If you have the same value as another ship, then they're going to be activating simultaneously, potentially blowing each other up. And the game does offer a manual way for you to determine which ships hit which ships. And I will say that I'm normally not that interested in integrating apps with board games, but I think this one does it really well in a way that I fully support, because once you're done the game, you just take a picture of the table, and then it's instantly going to be acting out the entire sequence of events and orchestrating that battle for you and tallying up that final score. A really fun game here that I do think is improved by this app, because it's going to be removing all that arduous scoring and just allowing you to focus on the most fun part of the game, which is placing out those tiles. But like I said, this giveaway is for the Ace Pledge, which is going to get you the core game and the 2 expansions. And all you got to do to enter this giveaway is leave a comment down below. You can say anything that you want, just make sure that you leave a comment with the hashtag Lightspeed, all one word. And if you're looking for something in particular, maybe you could let us know what you think about app integrations, and maybe this particular type of app integration where it's mostly just helping you with the scoring. I'm a huge fan of it, and I do use other apps to help with scoring with other games, but I know there is a lot of contention around apps and games, me being a part of that, but I'm interested to see what you all say in the comments. Good luck in the giveaways, and we did have a bunch of giveaways last week with Micro Midgard as well as Cosmic Chains and Roll a Coaster Park. Party Wanted, and Peep Spotting. But for this one, I ran the giveaway over on the Discord, and the order of the names here is going to be determining which of the games that you won. So make sure to check out your notifications, and you can either message me on Discord or email me at adam@shelfclutter.com, and I'll get those pledges all sorted out for you. It is always a constant battle for me to keep up with all the comments and emails and giveaways, especially with how busy of a week I've had. If you've reached out to me and you're waiting on a response, I always do respond. It just takes me a little bit more time sometimes than others. And it is Mother's Day this weekend, so I doubt I'll be able to make a big dent in my progress on that, but I will try to carve out some time this week to get all caught up. But even when it does take me a while to respond, just know that I really do appreciate all of the messages and all the views here on YouTube and all the comments and everything else that comes along with this channel. It really is what keeps me going here. And I hope these weekly videos provide a good amount of value back to all of you, along with those giveaways as a nice little bonus. But as always, thanks so much for tuning in, and until next time, keep that shelf cluttered and the table full.